Hey everybody, Deathblade here. I'm really excited to do this video. I'm gonna get right into it. It started with this tweet, which I'm gonna pull up here, in which I asked people on Twitter what they hated about Chinese fantasy novels, the tropes and cliches. And as you can see going down through here, I actually got quite a few responses, like 50 or 60 responses. And then I took those responses and I kind of compiled them together. I picked, added some that I could think of, and then I made this survey, which I'll show you right here, asking people to vote on what they disliked the most. And I got quite a few responses. I got about 2,000. I'm gonna put the link to that survey in the description below, and I'm gonna keep that survey live. If you come across this video later and have not taken the survey, why don't you go take it real quick, and then you can compare your votes to the results. I'm gonna reveal the top 10 most hated cliches, tropes in Chinese fantasy novels. I didn't do like a super detailed check of all of the entries because there were too many, but I did go through and spot check a bit, and I didn't see any evidence of people like trying to manipulate the vote. I don't know why anybody would want to do that anyway, but I would say that 2,000 is a pretty good data set. I've done a lot of polls throughout the years, and what I've noticed is that when you do a poll that gets several hundred or over 1,000 responses, usually the sort of general breakdown of responses after the first maybe 100 or 200 tends to remain the same. In other words, once you get about 100 or 200 votes, you're gonna see the breakdown of statistics, and those statistics don't tend to change. So I started watching kind of closely after it was about 1,000, and the top 10 didn't really change very much. I don't think any of them actually went up or down. They changed within a tenth of a percent or a few tenths of a percent. Anyway, so I think this is a pretty accurate assessment of at least the people who follow me and participate in my polls think about Chinese fantasy novels. Some of these I have talked about before in different videos. I'll link to those. And some of them I've actually been meaning to talk about in future videos, so I might make videos about them in the future. Before I get started, I do have to point out I let everybody vote as many times as they wanted for as many options as they wanted. I did ask them to limit it to sort of like a top 10 or their top few most hated. I think most people were able to stick to that. So let's get started. Starting with number 10, and this is well over 30% of the people who took the poll voted for this one. That is one-dimensional villains. So, I mean, all of the novels have them. As you can imagine, the authors are producing huge amounts of content, and sometimes they do have really cool villains with interesting backstories who develop over time. But a lot of times the villains are just there for the main character to steamroll over or to fight with for a little bit. It's pretty common in all of the stories. Number 9, how characters get offended easily. Now I did touch on this a little bit in the video in which I talked about face, and this is something that I have seen a lot of people complaining about when the bad guys get so offended because the main character did some random thing. To some extent, I feel that this is a cultural disconnect because I feel that the way the characters take offense in the novels is not as dramatically crazy as it seems. Again, it's a topic for probably an entire video, but long story short is the way that people get offended and communicate that fact to others is definitely different than in Western cultures. I think one of the reasons why that comes across as so annoying is because of cultural reasons. Number 8, this is where we break into the 40% of people having voted for this one. Enemies always assuming the MC is weak. So a trope of the genre is that the main character will show up, he's actually really strong and powerful, but these people will just assume that he's a weakling that they can crush. Again, this is another cultural thing, I think, but yeah, it is kind of annoying when that happens, and occasionally there will be situations where it doesn't happen, and I always see people commenting on that in the comment sections. There's a well-known saying about Mount Tai. If you haven't watched it, I did a video about it, but people always love it when the people do recognize Mount Tai as opposed to not recognizing Mount Tai. Number 7. Now, this is one this is one that I remember going way back into the day, supporting characters who get forgotten. So again, I think this is a result of the authors putting out a huge amount of content in a very short time. Most of them have some sort of outline or idea of what's coming ahead, and they do tend to have important characters, but a lot of times they throw in a cool side character. That person's with the main character for an arc or a couple arcs or maybe a couple chapters, and then the main character goes off to some other place and they never get mentioned again, even though they were sworn brothers or best friends or something like that. There was a classic example, I'm pretty sure from Coiling Dragon, that people bring up all the time. I never read all of Coiling Dragon, so if you know what I'm talking about, you mention it in the comments, or if you have another pet peeve or situation where this happened, please do feel free to bring it up in the comments. Another reason this happens, I think, is because of the sort of leveling nature of the novels. the characters get more and more powerful, and the main character a lot of times gets more and more powerful faster than other people, so he ends up leaving behind the old people who can't progress as high as he can. Let's go on to number 6. Now this is one, I'm gonna word this carefully because I'm not sure, I know there's YouTube has rules and different stuff like that, but this is one that definitely I don't want to take lightly, but on the other hand, I don't want to try to explain it. So this is when, I'm just going to put it on the screen here in words. I don't really want to say it out loud. But this is something that people obviously get really offended by. There are cultural ramifications and explanations as to why it happens so often in the novels. I don't claim to be some kind of expert in those sorts of things, and I don't really have any good explanation for it per se, but it does happen in the novels a lot. I think I'm kind of fortunate in that the several major novels that I have translated have not really had this. Now, I know what you people are going to say who have read I Shall Sail the Heavens and A Wool Eternal about a certain parrot and a certain kind of pill. That said, I think it's a little bit different from the way it's portrayed in some of the other novels. And so I feel like I'm kind of fortunate to have sort of sidestepped this in terms of the cliches and tropes. Okay, let's move on to number 5, and this is where we're getting into 50%. And this one, 50% of people who took the survey said that they don't like this, and that is when every female character falls in love with the main character. So I definitely agree with this one, and I think I'm lucky again in that the novels I have translated don't really have this, but there are certain novels where it's like it doesn't matter where the main character goes, which continent, which world, there's going to be some beautiful woman who instantly falls in love with him. And of course, harems are a big thing in many of these novels. That kind of plays into it. Obviously, the readers of the novels the majority are young males, so that's another explanation for why it happens, but it does get kind of annoying. It reminds me of one of the most famous authors of Wuxia novels, not Xianxia Xuanhuan fantasy, but the straight martial arts Wuxia novels. One of the most famous authors was Jin Yong. His heroes throughout almost all of his novels tended to be a typical heroic individual who espouses righteousness, trains hard, becomes powerful. But then in one of his later novels, he kind of flipped everything around and he had a character who was the opposite of all of that. He was a scoundrel, he never really got good at martial arts. And in that novel, it was a similar thing where he ended up picking up a whole bunch of wives. It kind of reminds me of that. Number 4, and this is another thing to do with female characters, strong female characters who get nerfed. So a lot of times a character will get introduced, female, super, super powerful, awesome, you're like, wow, this is so cool, and then she quickly becomes less powerful as the main character surpasses her. I think this is partly a product of what I mentioned earlier, just the general leveling aspect. We all know that the main characters of the novels usually end up becoming super ultimate power, and it wouldn't make sense for everybody to become that powerful. So by default, just by how the stories usually work, that's going to happen. But it is annoying when there's somebody introduced that just kind of is similar to the supporting character that gets forgotten. That's really annoying. I see readers asking for female characters a lot. The thing is that the novels, like I mentioned, in China are definitely aimed toward young men. And I think in general, the young guys in China are not necessarily interested in that. So the male authors are not going to really push that very hard. There is an entire subset of the genre that is aimed toward female readers, but those cultivation novels, based on my understanding, tend to be more about romance and relationships and stuff, and not the kind of action adventure that most people are looking for. I do have to plug my own book, Legends of Ogre Gate, because Legends of Ogre Gate, there are 2 main characters. One is a young man, one's a young woman. They are definitely equals. One of the main themes of the novel is the duality and how they both kind of create the superpowered martial arts. So if you haven't already checked that out, links in the description. Okay, moving on to number 3. We're down to the top 3. This is the number 3 most disliked cliche or trope Chinese fantasy novels, and that is hypocritical main characters. So I saw one of the examples on Twitter. Somebody was mentioning a main character who complains about being bullied and then goes on to bully other people. That's definitely annoying. I feel like a lot of these tropes are not present in the novels that I have translated. If you have read, whether it's I Shall Sail the Heavens, A Will Eternal, or Sage Monarch, and you disagree with me on that point, feel free to mention it in the comments. But I feel like a lot of the main characters I've translated tend to sidestep a lot of these super cliche elements. Number 2, ignorant or immature people who are millions of years old. Again, I talked about this in my video, why do immortal cultivators not act their age? And there are different explanations for it. I do feel that some of it also boils down to cultural things. The way the Chinese people handle face, handle insults, handle their personal prestige is definitely different than in Western culture. Everything from displays of grief to displays of anger are just handled differently. And so I think some of that has to do with it. Some of it has to do with just the fact that the authors are aiming for a melodramatic scene and they want to tap into the visceral emotions and get the reader to hate the bad guy or whatever. And so I think some of it, if you're going to look at it from a meta level, is definitely the authors just trying to pander to the emotions of the readers, the negative emotions of the readers, I guess you could say. Some of it could have an in-world explanation, which I talk about in that video about the age of cultivators. You can check it out if you're interested. All right, here it is. The #1 most hated, most disliked trope. Everybody seems to hate. It was the highest percentage of readers responded to it, and that is when a character tries to kill the main character and then gets mad, the main character tries to fight back. This is something I have been meaning to do a video about for a long time, and I still plan to do that in the future. Suffice to say, I do feel like this is another one of the ones where there are some cultural elements that play into it that are just hard for Western readers and non-Chinese readers to comprehend. I think Chinese readers probably get angry at it too, but it makes more sense in the context of Chinese culture, I think, again, pertaining to face and certain other matters. So I'm gonna save my commentary on that for another time. So to recap, here we go. I'm just gonna recap the top 10 again. 10, one-dimensional villains. 9, characters getting offended easily. 8, enemies always assuming the MC is weak. 7, supporting characters who get forgotten. 6, that thing as a weapon or that thing being excused or dismissed. 5, every female character falling in love with the main character. 4, strong female characters who get nerfed. 3, hypocritical main characters. 2, ignorant or immature people who are millions of years old. And #1, when people try to kill the MC, then get mad when the MC fights back. Now I do have a couple of honorable mentions. One of them that didn't make the list was when the MC, the main character, hides his identity for seemingly no reason or for some flimsy reason. That was the one that was at the very bottom, almost knocked out one-dimensional villains, but it remained beneath one-dimensional villains and did not make it into the top 10. And now here's another interesting one. There was one option for liking the tropes, and that almost did make it into the top 10. So there was number 10, number 11, and number 12 was liking the tropes. So I do think there are a lot of people who like the tropes. Now again, I didn't want to get too complicated and be like, I could have had multiple options, such as like all the tropes, like some of the tropes, like a few of the tropes. I didn't want to get into that complicated thing. So I think it's safe to say that there are some people who don't mind these things as much. Now, I do plan to do another video in the future where I'm going to talk about the bottom 10, which would, if you looked at it in reverse, would be the most acceptable tropes and cliches in Chinese fantasy novels. So there were a total of over 40 different options to pick from, and those were the top 10. I hope you found this interesting. For those of you who are big fans of the genre, were you surprised? Were you not surprised? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like my videos, please do like and subscribe, do the notification bell, share the video, all of that kind of stuff. I really also appreciate the support on Patreon. You can find links in the descriptions to support me that way. I really appreciate all of that stuff. Now I'll see you in the next video. Godsala.